Hello YouTube. Today I'm going to do kind of an interesting video, or at least to me I think it's kind of an interesting video. It's going to be on the Tartakower variation, which is a variation that I actually I teach it to my students. I try to tell them to play the Tartakower variation because it's a very easy way to get out your pieces in the Queen's Gambit Declined. And I want to answer a question that I don't feel like people answer enough, which is like in my mind like the big question of like the Tartakower, but like nobody really addresses it. So like, okay, so d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7. There's of course other move orders, but really I'm just going to try to get into the main line of the Tartakower. And at this point, the question that I think no one really addresses, or they don't address it in the way that I would like to have it explained, because I really need to understand, is right here. Do you play just the main line, straight away, just the Tartakower with b6 and just finish your development? Or do you play the move h6 first? And this is really interesting because I don't think anybody adequately explains whether or not you should be playing h6 or b6 first. Now, I will point out that as of today, I think just about every major top level player, they all play h6 first. So I'm going to try to explain. There's like a lot of reasons for this. Okay, so the easiest explanation, like the shortest explanation, is it's a pretty useful move. I mean, you make Luft, you make a spot for your king to get out later, so you're not going to have issues on the back rank. You also make sure that h7 won't become a target later for moves like queen c2 and bishop d3. But I think, this is kind of an oversimplified explanation. So what I really want to talk about is I want to talk about like the Tartakower itself, like what's really happening once we get a little bit deeper into the Tartakower. Well, after you play a move like b6, there's a lot of things that can happen. Basically, you're going to play one of two pawn structures in the middle of the board. And I just want to simplify this like just in the most simplest terms. You're going to either play a position where black has permanent weaknesses, basically where black has like hanging pawns, okay? Or you're going to play a position where white chooses to take on some permanent weaknesses, and usually this will be in the form of either hanging pawns or it'll be in the form of an isolated queen pawn. And basically another way to look at it is there's stuff going on here in the middle of the board, okay? And whether the exchanges happen now or the exchanges happen later, where you play c5 and then exchanges happen later, exchanges are going to happen. But more importantly, black is the one that's behind in development. So when those exchanges happen, the exchanges are going to be dictated by the person playing the white pieces. So they're going to be able to determine what structure they're going to play. So this is really interesting because in terms of how this affects your decision to play h6, the interesting thing is if you knew like what structure white was going to play, you could decide whether or not you wanted to play h6 or not. And I'll give you like a for instance, so like let's say that I play b6. There are scenarios where b6 is going to be like a super useful move. Okay, so like let's say that they play something like, well, they could play bishop e2. Let's say that they play rook c1 and then say bishop b7, and something like this happens. Okay, white's plan is to eventually build up some pressure along this long diagonal. Okay, so after a move like, say, rook d8, and then, say, queen c2, knight d7, rook d1, black can play g6. And as you can see, what black has managed to do is he's managed to get his pawn on a light square, and this has completely stumped this whole light squared diagonal for white. So this is ideal, for black. Black is actually looking to try to get a position like this where he has stumped white's only play along the biggest diagonal that matters to him, this light squared diagonal. Notice he has a light squared bishop. He doesn't have a dark squared bishop. And black has created this kind of fortress, and it's very helpful that this pawn is on h7 in this case. The problem is we can't make white play this particular pawn structure, and this is also very similar like if white chooses to play like an isolated queen pawn structure. White has alternatives to this pawn structure, and that's the issue. And the big issue is the pawn structure that white usually chooses is an immediate c captures d5. And this usually leads to a hanging pawn structure for black, like say after knight takes d5, takes, rook c1, bishop e6, because our bishop is on the wrong diagonal now, and then bishop d3. And now this is super uncomfortable, because this bishop here and this queen are going to be able to work together to put pressure here. And that makes things really awkward, because the move that you would absolutely like to play is c5. But if you play c5 here, you're actually losing a pawn to d captures c5, b captures c5, queen c2. And then the rook and the queen are hitting the pawn on c5, and the queen and the bishop are hitting the pawn on h7. And it's for this kind of super awkward reason of if you don't throw in h6, you're going to have to kind of throw in h6 later at a moment where you are losing a tempo on something that you would rather do. So like right here, you don't really have time to play the move you want to play. You don't have time to play the move c5, and that's a critical move. You want to get that move in. So the fact that you're not playing that move here, and you're going to have to play something else, you're going to have to play like a g6, or you're going to have to play an h6, or you're going to have to at least spend a move to play a move like rook c8, so you can give that pawn a little bit more defense before you run into queen c2. Because of that loss of tempo, this is kind of a problem when you're playing this structure. So now you're playing a hanging pawn structure, which you pretty much have to play if white decides to make you play it, but you're now playing that structure a tempo down. So that's why, if we just go back to the main line with h6, that's why every top player just about is playing h6 first, because believe it or not, even after you play the move h6 first, the most common structure that you're going to play after going into the Tartakower after b6 is this hanging pawn structure with c captures d5. And in the hanging pawn structure, you don't want that pawn to be hanging on h7 because then you're losing tempo on playing the move c5. And I think that's really important. That's just an idea that I wanted to get across, because it's just, I don't feel like it's explained. Like, why do all these top players play the move h6? And is there any advantage to leaving the pawn on h7? And yes, there's some advantages to leaving the pawn on h7 in certain pawn structures. If they don't play the hanging pawn structures, you're actually a little better off having that pawn on h7, because you can create kind of a permanent blockade on that diagonal. And that's helpful, especially in isolated queen pawn structures and any structure where the center stays, relatively stable, and they're going to build up on those light squares. But in the hanging pawn structure, you don't really want that pawn on h7. It's a liability. Okay, I hope that explanation of to play h6 or not to play h6 in the Tartakower, I hope that was a good explanation. And I hope you found that relatively helpful. Thank you for watching.